Professor Stephen Cohen on the line with us. We're talking about Russia as Syria, the United States, Presidents Putin and Obama. Stephen, where do you see this playing out? What are your best hopes and greatest fears?
My best hopes, you articulated, that Obama and Putin and their advisors, because neither man proceeds without consultation with his military intelligence and political aides, and yes, there is a politics around Putin. He has a problem politically in Moscow. In a word, the ultra-nationalists are convinced that Putin is about to sell out Ukraine in return for Syria with Obama. They have this view that Putin is not a resolute leader and that he will give up their ethnic countrymen and women in Donbass, in Ukraine, in return for protecting Assad and a Russian role in Syria. That will not happen, but that's a real politics in Moscow. But my hope is that, as you said, Tom, so well, that they will rise above themselves, as real leaders do, and form a substantial coalition. Now, there's a lot to be worked out. When you have a coalition, who leads, who's sitting at the head of the table, are there co-heads and the rest? Let's say this happens. Let's say a real military political coalition to defeat Islamic State in Iraq and in Syria develops. But Tom, let's be realistic, because you do politics and I do politics, though in different ways. You do it better, I follow it. There are enormous obstacles. The first one you mentioned, there's going to be tremendous opposition in Washington. Obama is going to be accused of appeasing Putin, who is often referred to by McCain and even Mrs. Clinton as a kind of Hitler. So Obama will have to deal with that opposition. And in international affairs, he's not been very good at that. He tends to bend and then capitulate, maybe for the sake of his domestic agenda, maybe because he really doesn't have a good grasp or a good vision when it comes to international relations. So we will see what happens in Washington, whether Obama can actually do this and reach out and join with Putin. But there's another problem. There's also such a politics in Moscow, and that's the Ukrainian crisis. It could flare up in any moment in a way that could disrupt any fragile agreement between Putin and Obama. And I think that the United States-backed government or regime in Kiev is so worried about the possibility of this kind of cooperation between Moscow and Washington in the Middle East that Washington may kind of forget Ukraine or lessen its commitment to the Kiev government. So I would not be surprised, not because I'm a conspiracy theorist, but because this always happens in Cold War, and we're in a Cold War, that Kiev stages a provocation to inflame the crisis, which is at a rather low level at the moment in Ukraine, and therefore redoubles the opposition in Washington to any rapprochement between Obama and Putin. And by the way, if the Kiev government does that, it will make Putin's position in Moscow all the more difficult. So I would say that we can hope, but as Reagan used to say, we ought to verify, and in this case, we ought to also see the obstacles.
Yeah. So the last time you and I talked, you were very concerned that we were looking at trigger to World War III kind of events. Are you still thinking that?
Well, we were talking at that time about Ukraine.
Yes.
And I have been arguing since you and I began nearly 2 years ago, I think, Tom. I mean, we talked before, but we began on a regular basis that the civil war in Ukraine, which is what it is, not primarily a Russian invasion, a civil war, had become a proxy war between the United States and Russia, with Russia supporting the rebels in Donbass and we supporting the government in Kiev. And when you have a proxy war, if that escalates, it becomes a Cuban Missile Crisis. So that was my concern. I am a little less concerned today, but only a little, because all the objective factors and subjective factors in the leadership in Ukraine and in Moscow and in Washington remain the same. That is, people like McCain continue to say we should be arming the Ukrainian government much more fully so they can fight more effectively, which runs the risk of bringing the Russians in a serious way. And then we would be in a Cuban Missile Crisis situation. Now we have the Syrian thing. And I mean, this is serious. And everybody, I mean, my young kids, my grandkids that would understand this, if American warplanes, Russian warplanes, Syrian warplanes, French warplanes, I think maybe Israeli warplanes, are all flying over Syria and Iraq, they got to be careful they don't shoot each other down.
Mm.
I mean, this is a very difficult, complex, technical situation beyond my understanding and yours, except that we know this really has to be coordinated. Somebody said the other day, I think an American official, no matter what the Russians do, the moment their aircraft are in the air, and so are ours, I think this was Petraeus actually briefing Congress, because suddenly he's back as a big authority on all this stuff. I think because his not very successful experiences in Afghanistan seemed to make him a great advisor on what we ought to do in Syria.
Right.
I'm not sure that's the way we should go, but, you know, Washington likes familiar faces,
Right.
And they don't want to hear outside views, so let them do what they do. But Petraeus said, we don't want somebody shooting at the wrong target.
Right.
And the possibility of that happening is great.
So
Imagine what would happen if the Russians inadvertently shot down an American warplane or vice versa. Then the political pressure in Moscow and Washington would really be on the leadership to retaliate. So what we now have, let me sum this up. We have a Cold War that's become a proxy war, but it's now on two fronts. It's Ukraine and in the air or on the ground over Syria in regard to the Islamic State. So here's a chance for cooperation. In the old Cold War, the 40-year Cold War, this often happened. It was full of conflict, but we found ways to cooperate, and it was managed because of the rules. The problem is there are no rules to it.
Yeah, and that's a very, very big problem. Professor Cohen, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks, Tom.
Very important and thoughtful conversation, and it's always great to get your input. Thank you very much. Professor Stephen Cohen, check out his book, Soviet Fates and Lost Alternatives. You can read his writings at thenation.com.